The first thing they noticed was the smell. Not the smell of mud, smoke, or damp wood that had followed them through the last months of the war. Not the sharp scent of machine oil, wet wool, and fear that had lived in every station, truck, and holding yard they had passed through. This was different. Warm, heavy, rich. It drifted through the early morning air before the doors even opened. Inside the transport truck, the women looked at each other without speaking. They had learned not to ask too many questions. In wartime, questions usually led nowhere good. The younger ones sat stiffly on the benches, hands folded tightly in their laps. The older prisoners kept their faces blank, hiding exhaustion behind silence. A few days earlier, they had still been in Europe, caught in the final confusion of collapse. Orders had vanished. Officers had disappeared. Whole units had broken apart and dissolved into roads full of civilians, soldiers, wagons, and smoke. By the time they were taken into Allied custody, most of them had already imagined the worst. They expected rough barracks, thin soup, hard bread, cold stares. That was what prison camp life meant in their minds. That was what rumors had prepared them for. No one had prepared them for this smell. The truck stopped with a jolt. Boots hit the ground outside. A voice called something in English. Then another voice, calmer, slower, repeated instructions in heavily accented German. Stay together. Step down carefully. One by one, they climbed out. The camp stretched before them under a pale morning sky. It was not luxurious, not comfortable, not soft. But it was not what they had imagined either. The fences were real. The guards were real. The rules were real. Yet the place looked organized rather than chaotic, functional rather than cruel. Long barracks sat in neat rows. Laundry lines moved gently in the breeze. Somewhere in the distance, metal pots clanged. A generator hummed. And underneath it all was that same smell, stronger now, rising from a low mess hall building near the center of the compound. Several of the women glanced toward it immediately. One of them, Lisa, frowned. "What are they cooking?" she whispered. No one answered. Beside her, Marta pulled her coat tighter and muttered, "Whatever it is, it won't be for long." That was the feeling shared by most of them. Any decent treatment would only be temporary. Any small comfort would come with a price. Better not to trust it. Better not to show interest. Better not to look hopeful. Hope by then felt more dangerous than hunger. A guard motioned them forward. They were led across the yard, boots crunching over gravel, toward a registration building first. Names were checked, belongings were counted, questions were asked. Most answers came quietly, cautiously. The women watched every expression, every gesture, searching for signs of mockery or hostility. Instead, they found routine. Clipboards, stamps, directions, blankets issued in stacks. One American clerk looked barely old enough to shave. He spoke quickly, made a mistake with a surname, apologized, and corrected it. That small moment unsettled several of them more than anger would have. They knew how to respond to cruelty. They did not know what to do with ordinary politeness. By the time registration ended, the smell from the mess hall had become almost unbearable. Not because it was bad, because it was good. Rich sausage, black pepper, something buttery, something baked. It rolled through the camp in waves, clinging to the air and pulling every tired thought toward it. Even those trying hardest to remain proud could feel their stomachs react. One of the younger prisoners, no older than 19, whispered, "That cannot be breakfast." An older woman answered without conviction, "Maybe it is for the guards." That seemed more likely. They were marched to the mess hall doors in a loose line. The wooden building buzzed with sound, boots scraping, trays shifting, voices echoing against the rafters. The prisoners braced themselves as they stepped inside. The room was plain but warm. Steam rose in thick clouds from the serving counter. Tin trays had already been stacked in neat columns. On one side stood large pans of golden biscuits, split and piled high. On the other side sat deep metal containers full of pale, thick gravy speckled with sausage and pepper. The women slowed. They had expected ladles of watery porridge. They had expected some version of institutional food, something colorless and joyless meant only to keep a body moving. Instead, the room smelled like a farmhouse kitchen. One of the American cooks, a broad man with rolled sleeves and flour on his forearms, looked up as the prisoners filed in. He wiped his hands on a towel, gave a short nod, and said something to the interpreter. The interpreter turned. "Take a tray. Move slowly. Everyone gets the same." Still they hesitated. Lisa stared at the biscuits. They were soft, tall, and uneven in the way real baked food often is. Not factory-made, not ration brick hard, fresh. The gravy was stranger still, thick enough to sit on a spoon, cream-colored, full of crumbled sausage. Nothing about it resembled anything she knew from home. Marta leaned closer and whispered, "What is it?" Lisa barely moved her lips. "I don't know." "Is it a trick?" "No." "How do you know?" "I don't, but no one makes that much food for a trick." At the front of the line, the first prisoner held out her tray with visible caution. A biscuit was placed on it, then another, then a heavy spoonful of gravy over the top. The woman blinked in confusion and stepped aside. The next prisoner got the same, then the next. When it was Lisa's turn, the cook looked at her tray, then at her face. For a brief second, she expected a joke or a cold remark. Instead, he simply asked the interpreter something. The interpreter translated, "He says, 'Take more if you are very hungry. There is enough.'" Lisa said nothing. She only stared. There is enough. Those words felt more foreign than the food. She moved down the line and sat at a long table with Marta and 3 others. Around them, the hall filled with low murmurs. No one ate immediately. Spoons hovered. Eyes narrowed suspiciously. The biscuits released little curls of steam where the gravy had soaked in. "It looks ruined," Marta said quietly. "It smelled better before I saw it," another woman muttered. Across the hall, one of the youngest prisoners carefully broke off a piece of biscuit with her fingers and tasted it plain first. Her expression changed instantly. She looked down as if surprised by her own face. Then she tried the gravy. She froze. "What?" someone asked from farther down the table. The girl swallowed. She looked almost embarrassed. "It's..." She shook her head once. "It's good." That earned a few skeptical glances. Then another prisoner tried it. Then another. Within seconds, the silence in the hall shifted. It did not disappear, but it changed shape. Suspicion gave way to confusion. Confusion gave way to something even stranger. Relief. Lise cut off a small piece of biscuit and tasted it first without gravy. It was soft, warm, and richer than anything she had eaten in months. Then, reluctantly, she dragged the piece through the white sausage gravy and lifted it to her mouth. Pepper, salt, cream, meat, butter. The flavor was unfamiliar, heavy, almost shocking. Her eyes widened. Across from her, Marta saw the reaction and whispered, "Well?" Lise took a second bite before answering. "I don't know what this is," she said. Marta leaned in. Lisa looked down at the tray, then back up. "But it is not camp food." Around them, the women began eating faster now, though still with an air of disbelief. Some kept glancing toward the serving line as if expecting someone to come and take the trays away. Others ate in silence, careful and controlled, unwilling to reveal too much emotion. But a few could not hide it. For the first time in a long while, the mess hall held something close to peace. Not celebration, not joy, just the quiet, stunned realization that reality had not followed the script they had feared. Outside, the war had reduced cities to rubble, scattered families, and erased the world they once understood. Inside that wooden mess hall, beneath the buzz of lights and the scrape of tin spoons, a group of exhausted prisoners encountered something small and human enough to confuse them more than cruelty ever could. A hot breakfast, a strange American dish, and the unsettling discovery that kindness could arrive in a form they did not even recognize. At the far end of the room, the broad-shouldered cook watched the tables for a moment, then turned back toward the kitchen without a word. For him, it was only breakfast. For the women eating it, it was the first crack in everything they thought captivity in America would be. And by the time the trays were half empty, whispers had already begun moving from table to table. What was this place? Why were they being treated like this? And what else had they been wrong about? By the next morning, the breakfast was no longer a surprise, but it was still a mystery. The women woke before dawn to the sound of footsteps outside the barracks, the distant clatter of metal buckets, and the muted voices of guards changing shifts. For a few long seconds, Lise forgot where she was. The wooden bunk above her creaked softly. Someone nearby coughed into a blanket. Cold morning air slipped through the cracks in the walls. Then the smell came again. Warm, peppery, rich. And suddenly everyone in the barracks knew exactly what time it was. No one said anything at first. That perhaps was the strangest part. Even after the shock of the previous morning, even after the first spoonful had proven that the food was real, The women still treated the entire thing with caution. It was one thing to be fed once. It was another thing entirely for it to become routine. Routine meant intention. Routine meant policy. Routine meant that what they had seen yesterday was not an accident. Marta sat up on her bunk and pulled on her coat with a frown. "Again," she murmured. Lisa glanced over. "You sound disappointed." "I sound suspicious." That made Lisa almost smile. Almost. The women dressed quietly and filed outside into the pale morning light. Frost still clung to the edges of the wooden steps, and the camp yard looked colorless under the low sky. American guards stood at their posts, collars turned up against the cold, while kitchen workers were already moving between the mess hall and a supply shed. Everything looked ordinary. That somehow made it harder to understand. As they crossed the yard, the younger prisoners were already whispering, "Maybe today it will be something else. Maybe that dish was only because we arrived. Maybe they are trying to impress inspectors. Maybe they want us calm." The last explanation felt safest, because it required no warmth, no humanity, and no rewriting of old assumptions. If the food had a purpose, if generosity was simply a method of order, then the world still made sense. Lise wanted to believe that. But she remembered the cook's face from the day before. There had been no performance in it, no smirk, no lesson. He had looked at them the same way a man might look at workers coming in from a field, tired people who needed breakfast. Inside the mess hall, the warmth hit them all at once. Steam drifted upward under hanging lamps. Metal trays clicked softly against one another. The smell of baked dough and sausage gravy rolled through the room again, heavy and familiar now. But there were new things too: scrambled eggs, fried potatoes, and a line of tin mugs ready for coffee. The women slowed as they entered. Marta looked around with narrowed eyes. "This is not prison food," one of the older women beside her replied. "Then stop calling it that." They moved through the line. This time the hands reaching for trays were steadier. Eyes still watched everything, but less from fear and more from disbelief that had not yet worn off. When Lisa reached the serving counter, the same flour-dusted American cook was there again. He recognized her, not with a smile exactly, but with the slight nod of someone who had seen her yesterday and remembered. He spooned gravy over 2 biscuits, added potatoes, then said something to the interpreter standing nearby. The interpreter turned. "He asks if yesterday was acceptable." Lisa blinked. She had not expected a question. For a second, she considered giving no answer at all. Then, because every woman in line behind her was listening, she said carefully, "Yes." The interpreter translated it. The cook gave one short nod and moved on to the next tray. Marta, who had heard everything, stared at Lisa as they walked to their table. "Acceptable?" It was. "You could have said good." Lisa sat down. "I was not prepared to say that." But Marta's mouth twitched, and for the first time since arriving at the camp, the expression on her face was something close to amusement. Breakfast changed the mood of the room more quickly that day. The women still sat in clusters, still kept their voices low, still avoided drawing too much attention. But the tension that had frozen their shoulders the day before had eased. Some even looked around while eating, noticing details they had ignored in their first state of shock. The windows had been repaired with careful boards and clean panes. The tables, though plain, had been scrubbed well. The American kitchen staff spoke loudly, casually, as though breakfast were simply another shift, another task, another morning in a place where people were expected to eat and keep going. No one seemed interested in humiliating them. No one seemed eager to remind them they had lost. That absence lingered in the room like a second kind of warmth. Across the table, a young prisoner named Anika finally asked the question everyone had been circling around. "Do all Americans eat like this?" A few women looked up. Marta answered first. "Surely not every day." An older prisoner cut into her potatoes and said, "Maybe in the countryside." Another shook her head. "No, this is exaggerated. It must be." Lisa tasted the gravy again before speaking. It was still unfamiliar, still too rich to make immediate sense to her memory of breakfast. But it was no longer strange in the alarming way it had been yesterday. It was becoming something else. Expected. "I think," Lisa said slowly, "that they simply do not think this food is remarkable." That earned silence. Because if she was right, then the meaning of the meal changed entirely. If this was ordinary to them, if biscuits, gravy, eggs, and potatoes were not a performance but a standard, then the women had not merely been surprised by kindness. They had collided with a different daily reality altogether. Annika looked down at her tray. Then what else here is ordinary? No one had an answer. Later that morning, the women were assigned light work around the campgrounds. Some helped with laundry sorting. Others swept walkways, carried boxes, or assisted in maintenance sheds under supervision. It was not easy work, but neither was it chaotic. Instructions were clear. Water breaks were regular. No one shouted unless they had to be heard over machinery. That unsettled many of them more than hardship would have. They had built mental defenses against cruelty. Those defenses had shape. They knew how to endure insult. They knew how to shrink themselves emotionally and wait for the day to end. But order without cruelty left them exposed. At midday, while carrying folded linens from one building to another, Lise passed behind the mess hall and noticed the same American cook smoking near a stack of crates. He stood with one boot against the wall, cap tilted back, looking tired rather than imposing. For a moment she considered walking past without acknowledging him. Then he saw her and lowered the cigarette. He said something in English too quickly for her to understand, then slowed down. "Breakfast," he said, pointing toward the building. "Good?" Lise stopped. His accent was broad and difficult, but the meaning was clear. She hesitated. "Yes." He nodded once. Then, with obvious effort, he added a single German word that sounded clumsy and out of place. "Gut?" It was pronounced poorly enough that, under almost any other circumstance, it might have sounded ridiculous. But he was trying. Lisa felt a strange pressure in her chest. Not gratitude exactly. Something more complicated than that. Something uncomfortable. "Yes," she said again, this time more firmly. "Gut." The cook grinned, just slightly, as if pleased that he had used the word correctly. Then he tapped ash to the ground and pointed to himself. "Texas." Lisa did not understand at first. He repeated it. "Texas. Home." Then he pointed toward the mess hall, mimed stirring a pot, and said, "Biscuits, gravy, Texas." Only then did she understand. This was not military food. This was his food. Something from his home, his table, his people. Something ordinary enough in his world that he had brought it here without ceremony, as if it needed no explanation. Lisa stood speechless for a second too long. The cook seemed to realize conversation had reached its limit. He tipped his head politely and returned to his cigarette. She walked away with the folded linens still in her arms, but her thoughts were no longer on work. At supper that evening, the women spoke more openly than before. Not loudly, never loudly, but the silence among them had started to crack. Annika wanted to know where Texas was. Marta wanted to know whether all Americans thought flour and sausage belonged together. One of the older prisoners quietly admitted she had been dreaming about the biscuits during afternoon work and seemed embarrassed by it. That made several others laugh under their breath. It was the first real laughter Lisa had heard in the camp. Soft, brief, guarded, but real. That night, back in the barracks, the conversation continued after lights out in low voices from bunk to bunk. Not about the war, not about blame, not about what had been lost, about food, about strange American habits, about the cook from Texas, about the impossible fact that a place they had feared might strip away the last of their dignity had instead handed them hot biscuits under ladles of thick sausage gravy and expected nothing from them except that they eat. Lisa lay awake, staring at the dark ceiling beams above her bunk. The camp was still a prison camp. The fences were still there. The guards were still armed. None of that had changed. And yet something had shifted inside the women since that first breakfast. They had arrived prepared to harden themselves against punishment. Instead, they were being forced into a far more confusing battle, the slow collapse of everything they had assumed about the people on the other side. And for Lisa, the most disturbing part was this. She was beginning to wonder what else they had been told that was not true. On the third morning, no one pretended not to notice the smell. Before the guards even called them out, women in the barracks were already awake, listening to the soft wind outside and waiting for that familiar warmth to drift through the cracks in the wood. By then, biscuits and sausage gravy had become more than breakfast. It had become a sign. Not that they were free, not that the war had been undone, not that fear had disappeared, but a sign that this place, strange as it was, would not be what they had imagined. When the women entered the mess hall, the room felt less foreign now. The scrape of boots, the clink of metal trays, the low voices of kitchen staff. It all sounded almost ordinary. Some of the prisoners still moved cautiously, but not with the same hard stiffness as before. Lisa noticed it first at her own table. Marta no longer stared at the food as if it might vanish. Anika no longer whispered before every bite. Even the older women, the ones most determined not to react, had stopped hiding their relief. The American cook from Texas was there again, working the line with the same tired, steady movements. No speech, no performance, just breakfast. When Lisa stepped forward with her tray, he placed 2 biscuits on it, covered them with gravy, and looked up. This time, before the interpreter could say anything, Lisa gave a small nod. "Good," she said in careful English. The cook smiled faintly. "Good." That was all. But somehow, it was enough. Later, back outside under the pale morning sky, the women stood for a moment before being sent to their duties. No one said much. They did not need to. The air between them had changed. A few days earlier, they had arrived expecting humiliation, hunger, and cold indifference. Instead, what unsettled them most was something far simpler: a hot meal, ordinary manners, and the quiet realization that their enemies were not behaving like the monsters they had been taught to expect. On the 3rd morning, no one pretended not to notice the smell. Before the guards even called them out, women in the barracks were already awake, listening to the soft wind outside and waiting for that familiar warmth to drift through the cracks in the wood. By then, biscuits and sausage gravy had become more than breakfast. It had become a sign. Not that they were free, not that the war had been undone, not that fear had disappeared, but a sign that this place, strange as it was, would not be what they had imagined. When the women entered the mess hall, the room felt less foreign now. The scrape of boots, the clink of metal trays, the low voices of kitchen staff. It all sounded almost ordinary. Some of the prisoners still moved cautiously, but not with the same hard stiffness as before. Lisa noticed it first at her own table. Marta no longer stared at the food as if it might vanish. Anika no longer whispered before every bite. Even the older women, the ones most determined not to react, had stopped hiding their relief. The American cook from Texas was there again, working the line with the same tired, steady movements. No speech, no performance, just breakfast. When Lisa stepped forward with her tray, he placed 2 biscuits on it, covered them with gravy, and looked up. This time, before the interpreter could say anything, Lisa gave a small nod. "Good," she said in careful English. The cook smiled faintly. "Good." That was all. But somehow, it was enough. Later, back outside under the pale morning sky, the women stood for a moment before being sent to their duties. No one said much. They did not need to. The air between them had changed. A few days earlier, they had arrived expecting humiliation, hunger, and cold indifference. Instead, what unsettled them most was something far simpler: a hot meal, ordinary manners, and the quiet realization that their enemies were not behaving like the monsters they had been taught to expect. On the 3rd morning, no one pretended not to notice the smell. Before the guards even called them out, women in the barracks were already awake, listening to the soft wind outside and waiting for that familiar warmth to drift through the cracks in the wood. By then, biscuits and sausage gravy had become more than breakfast. It had become a sign. Not that they were free, not that the war had been undone, not that fear had disappeared, but a sign that this place, strange as it was, would not be what they had imagined. When the women entered the mess hall, the room felt less foreign now. The scrape of boots, the clink of metal trays, the low voices of kitchen staff. It all sounded almost ordinary. Some of the prisoners still moved cautiously, but not with the same hard stiffness as before. Lisa noticed it first at her own table. Marta no longer stared at the food as if it might vanish. Anika no longer whispered before every bite. Even the older women, the ones most determined not to react, had stopped hiding their relief. The American cook from Texas was there again, working the line. The camp was still surrounded by fences. The war had still taken almost everything from them. The future was still uncertain. But in that small American mess hall, over soft biscuits and thick sausage gravy, something had cracked open. Not trust. Not yet. Just doubt. And sometimes, doubt was where the truth began.